talking with AG Bramble, AG Pete Bramble, goes by Pete, and of the 493rd Armored Field Artillery Battalion.
That's correct.
Headquarters.
Battery.
Battery. That's right. And if you could just start by telling us a little bit about where you grew up, your family, your friends.
I was born and raised on a farm in Butler County, Ohio, near Cincinnati. 143-acre farm, and we raised dairy cattle and had crops. And my job when I became old enough was to milk cows twice a day, 7 days a week, along with all the other chores. I went to school at a small community called Westchester and graduated in 1938. Went to a business college, took a one-year course, and went to business college, graduated from the business college, and from there I got a job with a foundry. It was a good German name, had the name of H.B. Deutscher Foundry. And we made a lot of castings and different types of metal products for industry. I was started in there as just a clerk, and I was married in 1942, January of 42, and got drafted in November of 42 into the Army and reported to Camp Campbell, Kentucky. And it was got my basic training there, and the camp was just beginning. They brought a cadre in from Fort Knox, which was, I think, out of the original 8th Army Division, Armored Division. And we took our basics there, and later we took, I was made corporal while I was at Camp Campbell, in charge of the wire communications, all types of telephone communications. Took some schooling, went to radio school and learned voice procedure for radio, and also learned the Morse code and how to send teletype and flag identifications, you know, things like that. Anything had to do with communications. And we took some maneuvers around the Nashville area from Camp Campbell, and from Nashville maneuvers we then were moved down to Abilene, Texas, where we went into Camp Barkley and took further training there at Camp Barkley, went on maneuvers down as far as Fort Hood, I think it was called, and we had finished all of our major training in the artillery, and then we were shipped to New York. I think it was Camp Grant, and from there overseas to England. And we landed in Liverpool, went over on an old troop ship, had been reconditioned, and we went in a zigzag course across the Atlantic because the German submarines were tailing all the convoys coming from America. And the reason for the zigzag course in those days, the submarines, when they fired a torpedo, they fired it and it had to go straight to the target. They couldn't manipulate it or make it go right or left or up or down. It had to go straight from where they fired it. And the reason for the zigzag course was to avoid being hit. Well, our convoy of the 12th Armored Division, we're fortunate we never lost any troops or ships. We came in and landed in Liverpool, England, and formed a tent city in a little town called Tidworth. It was about 40 kilometers from London, and we set up 4-man tents on a hillside, a windy hillside outside of Tidworth. And while there, we took some other training, mostly physical training, to keep in shape. And we had a few passes. I had a couple passes where I went to London. In fact, I bought a bicycle from somebody there and I pedaled in. Got good exercise with that. But while I was in London one time, I was in there when they had an air raid. Those German buzz bombs, V-bombs, I think they called them, came in, was landing in London. They had a complete blackout, and we all headed for the subways. And that was an experience I went through. And of course, another trip I took over to outside of Tidworth at the, I can't think of the name of the town right now. It's where they had those large stone I don't know, items that they had that people couldn't figure out how they ever got placed like they did. I can't think, huh?
Stonehenge?
Yeah, I think that's what it's called, Stonehenge, yeah. It was outside a city. I can't think of that name of that city though right now. But that was quite a sight to see that. And this particular town had an old cathedral. It was built in the 1500s. I managed to go through that. Well, from England, we weren't in on the initial invasion. Being an armored division, we had to wait till there was a foothold established. And we lost a lot of men gaining that foothold. But once they got the foothold, we came in. And from then on, we were able to move pretty good. We moved. I think our first battle was in a little town of France called AFA. And I recall, I believe it was in November, because I recall that we ate C rations, K rations, that type of thing, and they had a hot meal for us. We had a Thanksgiving dinner. It was turkey and dressing and all that, trimmings. And little school, a little French school nearby, all the soldiers shared their lunch with little kids, first graders, you know, and the kids were very happy about that. Well, our first battle was outside of AFA. I think it was in a little town called Singling, France. That was the second day of my combat. And my job was keeping telephone communications in between headquarters battery and the firing battery so they could fire back. And we were under direct fire from some German 88s. They was landing right in our area. And I was out trying to keep these wire communications intact, dropping in one of the shell holes and splicing wire where it broke, you know, and trying to keep things together, and shells landing all around. And I think there was a major in our outfit, Major Myers, I think his name was. He saw all this while everybody else was seeking cover, foxholes and basements, whatnot. And he said, put that guy in for a Bronze Star. So I was put in for a Bronze Star my second day of combat. And I didn't actually get a Bronze Star. They said not too many soldiers get Bronze Stars the first, second day of combat. So they gave me a certificate of merit. And I had that, and I was proud of that. I had it framed, you know, and kept it home. And then we fought on down through France. We fought through the Maginot and the Siegfried lines, and covered a lot of France, and we got up into Luxembourg, came down through Germany, through Munich, and had some pretty good battles. We captured the last remaining bridge going over the Blue Danube River, last intact bridge, and it was wired to be blown up. Our infantry got in ahead and dismantled the bombs, and the Germans tried desperately to knock that bridge out. But this one bridge alone opened up all the troops in the northern area to come into the southern part of France and Germany. And it's the first time World War I, they never even got that far. So we were quite proud about that. There's big signs along the bridge, Hellcat Division, 12th Armored salvaged this bridge. Germans threw a lot of aircraft at it, trying to knock it out, but they weren't successful. Well, then we fought on down and had one big battle. It was the Battle of Herlesheim, which was our really bad battle. We were very successful throughout the war, except in Herlesheim. We lost a lot of tanks and lost a lot of men. There were men captured, and we walked into a trap. The Germans had two Panzer divisions waiting for us, really, and then we just two Panzer divisions, and we thought it was just a few artillery pieces, and they knocked out tanks, and we lost a lot of soldiers. But I was fortunate enough I never got hurt all through the war. In fact, a couple bruises and whatnot. Fell out of a tree one time laying wire.
What was your experience at Hurlesham?
My experience, we were a backup support group with artillery to try to help these tanks that were taking a beating. We were dropping artillery on the targets ahead. And in fact, it was only 493rd, 494th, 495th, all three artillery battalions. And that's one thing that was really, I thought, was marvelous in the war. The 493rd, I watched the whole operation. We could send one shell out from, we had an A, B, and C batteries. There were 6 105 howitzers in each battery. And they could send, they were all hooked together by telephone or radio. They could fire one shot out on a target that maybe the forward observers told us about. They could see where that shot landed. They could send one more shell out, say one landed here, one landed here, target was here. They could hit that target, that third shot, dead on. And not only that, they could bring in the whole 3 A, B, and C battalions. They could bring all 3 of them in, and they'd all, by reading the map and saying where those 2 shells landed, they could put their shells on that same target. And we were dropping shells on the 88s and all those outfits, and the Germans were firing at us, and eventually it helped end that. The tanks retreated, the ones that could, the ones that weren't knocked out. Our tanks were able, the German tank was superior to our tank. They could penetrate the armor on our tank, and we couldn't penetrate their armor. So it was a disadvantage that way. But we managed to survive that, and then we became the mystery division. General Patton was in charge of the 3rd Army, and General Patch was in charge of the 7th Army, which we were in. We were in the 7th Army. General Patch had the 3rd Army, which was further south at that time. And General Patch sent word to Eisenhower that he wanted the 12th Armored Division. He knew we were a good fighting group. He wanted the 12th Armored Division to help him after Patton had talked to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower gave him permission to take us out. But he said that we'd have to black out all of our bumpers, take all of our insignia off, so the Germans wouldn't know that we were out of Patch's army, and we had weakened his 7th Army and to help the 3rd Army. Well, anyway, we went in and we drove for Patton, spearheaded his drive, and just went through town after town. Sometimes the Germans were on the sides of the road with ammunition and guns and everything. We drove right by them, told them to get their vehicles out of the way. Things were starting to change, and they were realizing that the Germans were getting beat. And they weren't, you had snipers and a few other things, but they weren't really giving us a good battle towards the end. And we realized that, and taking our tanks through that drive, we just didn't bother to stop. A lot of towns would throw up a white flag, surrender the town. But you'd still get some fire, but we'd fire back and knock the buildings down and whatnot. But we drove through, and Patton really admitted that it was the best thing that ever happened. He said we were the mystery division, and we helped him win the war. And he took credit for a lot of things that we should have gotten some credit for, but didn't get the credit at the time. But now the news is starting to come out that we were the mystery division, and we managed to help Patton. My experience, one experience that I had in this drive was when we started getting around Nuremberg, when we saw these concentration camps, Holocaust camps. And I was one of the first foot soldiers, after one camp had been taken over, to walk in and see the sights that I never had anticipated seeing. I walked in we pulled off the side of the road while we were driving, and I told my buddy, I said, that looks like a camp over there. Maybe they got American prisoners in it. It was quite a distance off, and we grabbed our rifles and headed for it. and the gates were wide open. Here it was one of those Holocaust camps. Walking in the camp, there was dead bodies laying along the side of the street on both sides. On the right-hand side, there was about 5 or 6 buildings, and they were the bunks for the Jewish people, and they were built like an old A-frame building with a dugout in the middle, long buildings, had benches in there for them to sleep on, and they had locked in these Jewish prisoners and set fire to the building, burn them alive. Ones that come running out, they shot, and it was a camp. I've been told since by a Jewish fellow from out of Cincinnati, that it was the sick, what they called the sick camp that I saw. Of course, there's beaucoup camps over there. It was a sick camp where they kept a lot of the sick people and contagious disease signs and typhus and things like that written on the buildings. So I didn't want to go in any of the buildings, so I stayed out of that. But I did see these sites. I saw these people had come out and were burning alive, dead. They were dead, but their bodies burning. And I and some other fellows got some pictures of that. And I brought some back. Some have been published already. On one siding, I can remember, there's so many camps and everybody described a different camp. There was no guard post on the 4 corners of the camp that I walked into. It was just a barbed wire enclosure. But on the left side, there was a railroad siding came in. That railroad siding had flat cars in there with dead, naked, emaciated bodies. Their arms no bigger than babies' arms. And just heaped up. They hadn't had time to bury them yet. And I wrote a letter to my wife right after I saw that site. I'd like to read it to you if you don't mind. This is proof. This letter is in the Holocaust Museum in Washington too, and I've sent it down to a couple universities. Professors have asked me for it. This letter I wrote to my wife after walking in a Holocaust camp near Landsberg. It was all letters have been censored, you know, during the war. We weren't allowed to tell any place where we'd been or what we'd seen, but this was stamped by Lieutenant Clinch. He was supposed to censor it, and he never censored nothing out of it. It was dated April 27, 1945. I wrote, "Dearest Mickey, I'm starting this letter along the road. I want to write it while certain things are fresh in my mind. I just saw a sight I will never forget. Do you remember the Stars and Stripes, where it showed a picture of an American prisoner lying in a bed, just skin and bones? Well, while we were advancing today, we saw what was left of about 4,000 beaten and starved Jewish, French, and Polish prisoners, mostly all Jews. About 50 were living, their arms and legs no bigger than the legs of a baby, stomachs and cheeks sunk in. I saw hundreds lying on the ground in the prison, stripped naked and dead, no flesh on them. Flies had been working on them for 3 days. I saw hundreds in one building laying all over one another, the building and flesh still burning. I talked to one Jewish boy. He said they hadn't had anything to eat for 5 days. The Germans took off just a few hours earlier. The ones still living were so weak they couldn't hardly stand up. Some couldn't. They lay on the ground asking us for something to eat. I had a part of a pack of cigarettes in my pockets they really fought over. They saw Moore and I, who was with me, come in the gate of their camp. They came running and yelling and falling. They dropped to the ground, kissed her clothes. Some were bleeding profusely from German SS troopers beating them. I saw a strap with blood all over it. One Jew pointed out his father laying dead. He said the Germans shot all the sick and crippled ones with a pistol. One of the fellows took pictures of it, and he promised me one. I'll send it. I never believed a lot of these atrocity stories until I saw this, honey. Take my word for it, it is true. I was unable to eat for thinking about these poor guys, their clothes with prison clothes, blue and white stripes. Well, enough for that. We had a surprise today. One of the fellows that was taken prisoner back at Bassweiler, France, walked into our area. He's one of 1,700 others that had been freed. Lieutenant Carson is still a prisoner of war, according to this fellow. and then I went on. Most of the rest of it's just personal. But I wanted to read that to you because when I came home from the Army, I told my wife I don't want to talk about anything. I don't want to discuss the war, as I want to forget it. Well, after about 50 years, we started hearing stories coming in over the Hellcat News that the German kids were saying there was no Holocaust. American kids, 50 years, they didn't know anything about it. Some of them were saying there was no Holocaust. And the Hellcat News says, start telling your story. So that's when I started telling my story. I told it to Cincinnati Enquirer and several other newspapers I interviewed. I had a video interview in Cincinnati that's been put on TV. And I have had this letter sent to, I went to the Holocaust Museum. I had this letter, it's up there someplace published. And I sent it to the Citadel. There's a professor down there writing some history, and he wanted a copy. And then I spoke at several of the Jewish synagogues in Cincinnati. I even met a couple people that were prisoners. And this is pretty much my Army story. I got early dismissal from the war over there because they were sending us to Japan. And one of the best things that ever happened in history when Harry Truman dropped that bomb. That was really a lifesaver for many soldiers. We would have lost millions of soldiers in Japan if he hadn't done that. So pretty much my story. I was heading for Japan, but I hit New York Harbor, and the Japs had that bomb dropped on them, and they surrendered. So I was pretty soon discharged. I had plenty of points, and I got 2 Bronze Stars for gallantry. One, that second day of combat, they finally changed that to a Bronze Star, and then another time in Bischweiler, I got a Bronze Star for reestablishing some telephone lines that were taking German 88 fire. Pretty much my life story, and I appreciate the chance I have to tell you this because I like to know that younger generation coming on will hear this story and other stories that people are telling, and they'll be able to tell their kids and grandkids, and it won't be said that the Holocaust never happened. Let's hope it never happens again. And I thank you for the opportunity.